All right, great. 19 people. That's great. Okay. So let me go through these slides real quick, and then we'll open up to questions. Okay. So the first thing is, again, John Locke, old English guy, came up with this philosophy of property, and he famously said that the only purpose of having government is to protect private property. This is obviously very influential to the founders who drafted the Constitution. And so James Madison took this very seriously. And so we'll go through a few details of Mr. Madison. So Madison, who was president, secretary of state, helped write the Constitution, took a bunch of notes during the convention, lawyer, plantation farmer, slaveholder. He said the first purpose of the new legal constitutional order was to protect the different and unequal faculties for acquiring property. So in other words, he wants to reward people who have property, and he wants to keep out people who do not have property. And this was the belief at the time that people who had property, and the more property you had, the better citizen you were. And if you didn't have property, then you didn't deserve to be a citizen. The way that this worked in practical reality was they started by taking the property from the king. So they take the property away from the British. The next step was to take property away from the American Indians, also the French and the Spanish in the West and the South. And then after they took the property, they started enforcing property rights by taking it to court. So if you wanted to battle over whose property it was, you had to bring paperwork to show that it was your property. It's kind of counterintuitive here, right? Because they took the property from somebody else, and then they defend it with their own new legal system that they've designed. But again, this is James Madison and others. This was the whole point of having the Constitution, so that they could take property and keep it for themselves. So this allowed three types of property: real estate, which is not the house, but the property that's underneath the house; goods, things that we all buy and sell every day; and then also humans. And those could also be passed down to children. So one kind of interesting trivia thing here is that it's a common practice during this time for a child, usually around 7 or 8 years old, to own an enslaved African child who is about 6 or 8 years old. So it's like somebody who's about the same age, and they're teaching children how to own human beings as property. Again, this is a very common thing among those who owned property. So I just want to give you that background. These are the people who are drafting the Constitution. Again, they're using this philosophy from John Locke, and this is kind of their basis of starting this government. So as you can see, there is no right to housing or to equal property in the Constitution. This is about making sure that there's unequal property and keeping it that way. So a strange thing happens after the Civil War, and the Congress decides to pass this law called the Homestead Act, which basically takes land away from Indians, moves them onto reservations, and then they give a bunch of land to what they call deserving people who applied. And what made you get the free land, what made you deserving, is that you would live there for 5 years, you'd develop the land, and you'd improve it. Very important principle of constitutional law and property is that you have to improve the land in order to be deserving. That shows that you are supposed to be on that land. That's their idea. Now, of course, that's what was on paper. In reality, many people failed. Like about half the people failed to actually keep the land. They didn't improve the land. And there was a lot of corruption. So railroad companies, big corporations, rich people would go pretend to buy the land for other people, or they'd take it from other people and they'd accumulate as much land as they can and use it for economic profit. So again, the Constitution doesn't protect equal property, it protects unequal property. It's kind of like whoever can steal the most land, that's the one who wins the game. This is also then leads into, around the same time, this concept of vagrancy laws. So if you didn't have land, and if you weren't employed, if you weren't laboring, if you weren't working, then that made you a criminal. That made you a bad person, and you weren't deserving of any rights, and you weren't allowed to participate in government. And this was defined as a person who wandered from place to place without having any money, right? Not having any support, not having any property. And so this essentially created, you were a criminal if you were homeless and if you were jobless. And you can see this goes back to the ideology of people with property are good, those are good citizens. The people without property, they're bad. So there's like this little joke over here in the cartoon. It's like, you know, it's not good enough for you just to show up on time and work hard. You're going to have to work through your break. This is the idea, this, you know, is a religious idea that your sin could go away and labor was good for poor people because it disciplines them and it makes them not lazy. Otherwise, they'd be lazy and evil and they'd do bad things. Okay, this is obviously ridiculous, and it obviously helps the capitalists keep labor costs down because it increases how many people are forced to work for low wages. But again, the Constitution is designed to protect that property against people who don't have property. And so the laws are in favor of the capitalists. And so this kind of starts pitting together this property ideology against the human rights ideology. And so people are starting to debate this more and more into the early 1900s. So again, the message there is to remember that the ideology is that only deserving get equal opportunity. So you have to show that you deserve it by working really hard, and this is where the myth of hard work comes in. It's kind of a rigged game. It doesn't really matter how much you work because they're going to keep adding more and more things to make it harder for you. The way this works out today is that there's a political struggle, there's a fight for how areas are going to be developed and what properties can be used. And this is a political process that they call zoning and land use. And so you can kind of see here on this map, you know, if you ever wanted to go to this, you go to NYC Planning and Zola, you can look and see where do they want to put parks, where do they want to put, you know, industrial areas, where do they want to put manufacturing areas, right? They've got all these kind of ways of doing this, but again, it's a political process. So of course, the people who own property have more say and participate more than the people who don't have property. So the message here is to remember that property use and distribution is political, and it's a struggle that's based in unequal participation. Now, the next level to think about this is the economy. So at the economic level, you have to remember that recessions come and go. All the recessions on here, all the red marks. So you have growth in the economy, then it declines. Growth in the economy, then it declines. Growth in the economy, then it declines. You see over the last 100 years, there's more recessions. And so every time there's a recession, then you're going to see fewer jobs, right? Lots of people are going to lose their jobs. Things are going to cost more. That's what we call inflation. Most importantly, this is where gentrification begins because speculation increases. People with lots of money start looking at places that are losing money, right? Where lots of people are losing their job, where costs are going up. They look at those places and they start buying up all that property, just like they did in the Homestead Act, just like they did in the beginning of the Constitution, because the game in the Constitution is to take property. And this also leads to evictions. And so as evictions increase, as people can't afford their rent, then homelessness also goes up as well. So finally, in the 1970s, the Supreme Court decided that something had to be done about this in New York. But notice it's a right to shelter, it's not a right to housing. So you don't get an equal right to property or equal right to having a house, but they'll put you in a shelter. And that's what the state court here in New York said, and then it was confirmed by the Court of Appeals. And this was generally the right for homeless people to have access to a shelter, especially for overnight, but they have to prove, so here it goes back to the deserving, they have to prove that they have one of these conditions, and they have to show that they're in need. Kind of a very difficult thing to do, but some people are able to do it. And then in the 2000s, there was another case, Callahan-Carey case, because the homeless shelter started evicting people based on not being deserving, that they weren't working hard enough, that they were lazy, that they were, you know, having problems. And so you see this back and forth over and over again, where the property holders are trying to defend themselves against the people without property. And it's all part of this economic structure. Now, since the 1940s, an interesting development has been that the international human rights community has declared that housing should be a right. But that's not binding in the U.S. courts, right? So you can't use that international law to get property or to get housing in the United States. So it's more of like a statement. It's a norm that people think that everyone should be able to have a house. Again, that's pretty recent. That's only since the 1940s that people have been thinking about this. So the last thing to think about then is that we really don't have a right to housing, but we have this claim that we should have it. And then this goes to the idea of the right to have rights. So people who definitely have the right to have rights are those who have property and they're protected by the Constitution. The rest of us, it's kind of like a political statement. You're saying we deserve to have rights, but the Constitution has not generally recognized that in practice. And then obviously those with property and those with money then have more resources and they can fight against people in court. So this is, again, this whole constitutional game is designed to keep things unequal, right? So if I go back to the James Madison quote, that's the whole purpose. This is, it's kind of amazing that he admitted this, right? But this is the whole point of having the Constitution, is to keep property unequal. And again, this is on the myth that people who already own property are just better people. They're better citizens. So I just want to kind of frame that so that you kind of have a better understanding of what the problem of homelessness is, right? It's a structural problem. It's part of the system, right? And it's less about individuals, except for as it relates to the myth of individualism and how people should be able to work harder. And that's what this kind of cartoon here is that that's going to be the game. You're always going to have to work